So last time we were talking about the birthright and being the first, and why that was something that Eisav was so completely invested in. So I want to ask you something about Yaakov and Eisav that you may have thought about. Okay, if environment is all there is, Yaakov and Eisav should have turned out the same, right? Same parents, same upbringing. They turned out to be very, very different, even though from the womb they both wanted the same things. They turned out to be very different. So the key to that is going to be what we're going to be learning today, which is why Yitzchak loved Eisav so much. So it says in the text, "Hitzayed b'fiv," that he brought in prey with his mouth. So the simple meaning of that is he would catch prey, hunt it, kill it, cook it, and then put it in everyone's mouth, serve meals. But the more sophisticated meaning that Rashi talks about is that he would hunt with his mouth, meaning he would seek to deceive people about who he really is, using his mouth as his weapon. So going back to this, he would ask religious-oriented questions that would make Yitzchak think that he's a believer and that he wants to do things right. So there are two examples that the sages bring. Do you know what Meiser is? What's Meiser? You give 10%. So there are several kinds of Meiser. One is with money, that's what you're familiar with. But another is with produce. If you were a farmer and you actually, let's say, had apples, you would have to give a 10th. So it has to do with things that grow from the earth. So Eisav said, Abba, I have to ask you something. Suppose I go into the salt business. Do I have to take a 10th of the salt? What do you think? What do you think the answer to that question would be? The answer is no. It doesn't grow. It's not from the earth. Okay, but he asked it. Now, what kind of picture do you get of who he is when you hear the question? Think about it. You have halacha classes here in Gesher. So when you ask a question like, Rabbi, suppose I forget to daven, there's like something I'm supposed to do. Doesn't that make you sound pious and interested and like sincere? Yeah? So that was the image that Eisav was trying to develop. Okay, the other question he had is, do I have to tithe straw? Now straw grows, so it's a better question at least. What do you think? Do you think you would have to do Meiser from straw? So the answer is no, it's not edible. But when he asked these questions, his purpose was to be deceitful. That's the simple meaning of this. But I want to take you to a deeper place. It could be he was sincere. He really didn't know the answers to these questions. But he wasn't asking out of piety. He was asking out of wanting to make an impression anyway. So he was a mixed bag. Do you understand what I'm saying? So I want you to picture this. Somebody here in Neve who has notebooks full of information and who believes every word that she writes down and doesn't keep anything. Could you picture this? There are girls like this, right? Why is that the case? How come knowing, believing, and doing are often in three different places? Okay, so I'm saying even if your belief is really there, in Neve could be a person again is exploring. It's a different thing. It was a bad example. But let's say you have somebody who's not exploring, they really believe. So I'll give an example with you. Everybody in this room really believes that it's a bad idea to lie. Any of you pro-lying? Okay. Okay, so that's the honest person. The rest of you, or whatever. Okay. Is there anybody in this room who could say they didn't tell a lie in the last year? How about half year? Okay. Do I have to take it further? How about the last 15 minutes? No, like whatever. Okay, so how come you believe it? You believe that lying is bad, but you don't do it. How come? What's the blockage? So the desire to do it is speaking louder than what you know. So that means I want you to hear what you're saying because it's a very big idea. There's holiness in not lying. You could see this? Imagine, I have to tell you a true story that my son in America is a principal, and he always he does like a weekly newspaper for the kids. It's elementary school. So they have like the kid of the week gets his picture in the paper, you know what I mean? It's a very sweet thing. So he's always looking for stories. So he asks people who know great people, tell me a story about someone. So he just heard this story. So this took place after the Holocaust. The Panovich Rav, who you never heard of, Yosef Kahneman, was the only surviving Lithuanian communal rabbi. Could you imagine that? There were other rabbis who survived, but they were heads of yeshivas. But he's the only rabbi who had a community who survived. But he survived alone. His family was gone, all of his writings were gone, everything was gone. He got to Israel and he had two dreams. One was he wanted to make a home for all, there were so many orphans because adults often didn't survive as well as kids did. Okay, he wanted a place for orphans to be where they could feel like they have someone taking care of them, and he wanted to start a yeshiva. And he did them both simultaneously. So the name of the orphanage was called Batei Avot, which means parents' house. In modern Hebrew, now we're like the post-Holocaust era, that's the word for old age home. It's the place where you put your parents. Okay, but then it was the place where people go to have parents. Okay, and the other was the great Panovich Yeshiva in Bnei Brak. So how did he get these going? He had to do incredible fundraising. He turned himself into a beggar to support these institutions. You could see this? So he had a son. His son was named Avraham. His son made his way to America. He would often fundraise for his father. But one year he came to Israel. He said to his father, there's no way you can keep two different institutions going. You have to choose between them. Which one is your dream? Which is the one you want to invest your life into? They're both going to collapse if you're spreading things so thin. We're behind in salaries. We're behind in everything. We can't go on like this. Okay, which would you choose if you were the Panovich Rav? The orphanage or the yeshiva? Which is what he chose. He said, I want more than anything to reestablish Torah, because without Torah there's no morality, there's no life. But Torah will never be firmly on the ground unless there's also kindness. So he refused to close at either of them. Okay? So here's a story about how he related to the orphanage. A child came to the orphanage, was taken to the orphanage. He was 10 years old. He was brought in by his aunt, who was older, and she said she just doesn't have the energy to take care of a 10-year-old. So the woman who ran the orphanage, name was Mrs. Monk, and she was a very warm person. I once met her, very warm, very loving. She she embraced him. She said, welcome. You should feel at home here. We'll take care of you. Come sit down right now. Have something to eat. So while he was eating, she came out. She had these prepackaged bags that had in a sheet, a pillowcase, a blanket, pajamas, and underwear. And she said, this is for you. I'll show you your room. This is all for you. No one else. This is your things. They're all new. They're all clean. You can make yourself comfortable. And he wouldn't. He was okay with eating, but he wouldn't take off his clothes to take a shower. And he didn't even want to open the package. So that night she decided, all right, who knows what he's seen, who knows what he's been through. She let him sleep on the mattress with his clothes. Okay, this went on to the next day. The next day she said, why don't you want to take a shower? There's warm water, here's the soap, you could smell it smells good. He said no. The third day, she called the Panovich Rav and said, we have a problem here. He's refusing to wash, he's filthy. He won't change his clothes. I don't know what to do. I've tried to explain him. I even tried to bribe him. I have a hidden chocolate bar. In those years, Israel was very, very poor, not like today. She had this one chocolate bar that a donor had given her for the kids, and she broke it out into little squares, and she hid it for special occasions. So I offered him a whole chocolate bar, and he won't do it. I don't know what to do. So the Rav spoke to him. He said, you could see me, I come every Friday, I give everybody treats. I'm like your grandfather. Take a shower, it'll be fine. And he said, no. The fourth day, I realized he probably had lice. He was the fourth day, the Rav said, okay, we're going to take this to the Chazon Ish because I don't know what to do at this point. Do you ever hear of the Chazon Ish? He was the undisputed leader of Orthodox Jewry in his time in Israel. We're talking about the 50s. Brilliant scholar, very refined person. He also lived very simply. So he took him to the Rav's house. The Rav was quite elderly at this point. And he put his arm around him and said, Matala, you don't want to take a shower? And he said, no. So he said, tell me why. So the child first wouldn't answer, but eventually did break down. He was embarrassed to leave this rabbi just like sitting there waiting for him like this. He said, look, every place I took a shower, they took my clothes and I never saw it again. And they gave me these like striped clothes to keep me from escaping. I'm not taking off my clothes again for people I don't know. That's what he said. And the Panovich Rav was so moved by this, he began to weep. He couldn't bear hearing this. So the Chazon Ish said to him, I'll tell you what, trust Mrs. Monk. She's not like the people who you met. She'll watch your clothes. I'll tell her to watch your clothes. She'll keep them in her office. He said, I don't know her. I don't trust her. He said, how about the Rav? And he said, no. Now they had brought a psychologist to speak to me. Certainly didn't trust the psychologist, but the Chazon Ish said, I have never told a lie. Will you trust me? Your clothes will be here when you finish. And he said, okay. So Mrs. Monk took him back with her to the orphanage, and he said, but began to take him back, but he wasn't ready to go. He said, I'm going to take my clothes off here, not there. So he went to a side room, and he walked in the street in the new pajamas. He's filthy, but he left all of his filthy clothes there in the Chazon Ish's house for the Chazon Ish to watch. So she took him back to the orphanage, convinced him to get in the shower. He came back clean with the clean pajamas, no socks, no shoes. He wasn't willing to do anything in the way of cooperation until he saw his clothes. In the meantime, what happened? The Chazon Ish asked one of the assistants in his house to bring a basin of water. He washed the clothes. So the sister was like, let me wash the clothes. It's not your job. He said, no, this child has to know I care about him. So he and the Rav together washed the pajamas and the clothes and the underwear, and everything is filthy and repulsive. They had to like change the water numerous times. And the person who told the story, who was there, he still remembers the Chazon Ish was very meticulous, scrubbing the collar of the shirt because he wanted to give him a clean shirt. Then they hung it in the line. B'nai Brak is hot, things dry pretty quickly. So the child comes back. He says, where are my clothes? He sees they're not on the table where he left them. So he said, I washed them, they're on the line. So he said, well, so, what do I have now? So he said, tonight you'll sleep in my house. And then in the morning the clothes will be dry and you'll wear them and Mrs. Monk will come and take you. Okay, clear? So the reason I'm telling you this story is because it's a story of somebody for whom there isn't a gap between what they know and believe and what they do. And from the story you could hear what the key is. When you know something and believe it but don't want to do it, it's because you closed your heart. It's not about information, it's about emotion. And the reason why we close our hearts are fear. Fear of change, fear of commitment, fear of losing something. So that was Eisav. He knew everything, he believed everything. But he closed his heart against everything he knew. So if you understand this, you'll understand why his story is in the Torah. Why do you think his story is in the Torah? The purpose of the story is so that we could learn from what he became, which you'll see later. You have a choice. You can close your heart and you'll end up in Eisav. Or you could sensitize your heart and you won't. So it's up to you. Keeping your heart open isn't easy. You have to be courageous to open your heart. There are things you have to give up when you know the truth. Okay? Okay, so that's what happens. So that's where things are left at this part of the Parsha. Then the Torah takes a whole other turn. So we leave Yaakov, Eisav, the birthright sold. Then there's a famine. And I told you yesterday I would tell you about famines. Nobody knows how many famines there were in the world's history. Is that true? Is it true, Daddy? No one knows. There are places in the world we don't even know about. Okay, are there any famines taking place in the world today? I'm sure in the Sahel. Okay, so there are 10 famines, though, that are mentioned in the Torah because those famines had a purposeful reason for being. The purpose was to turn things around, to get people to open their hearts. So I'm not going to take you through all 10 of them. I'm going to take you through 3 of them, okay? The first was Adam, when he was expelled from the Garden of Eden, who actually suffered hunger. Why do you think God let him suffer hunger? To be appreciative and to take responsibility for your life. In the Garden of Eden, he had no responsibility. Everything was at hand. He had to do nothing. He had to take responsibility. The last of the 3 that I'm going to tell you about was in the time of Ruth. Do you know the Ruth story? Yes, no? Here, in short, is the Ruth story. After the Jews left the desert, they received the Torah, left the desert, enter Israel. They had no central government, and it worked. How did it work? The Torah itself was their government. So the people who enforced the Torah and who made Torah decisions were a group of elders, and there would invariably emerge one who would be a leader. So the name of a leader in that era was a shofet. A shofet is a leader. It's often translated as a judge, but we're not talking about a courtroom judge. We're talking about someone whose judgment was what determined the direction people would go. So what do you think ended this era of not needing a central government? Divisiveness. So he said. So I also said. Okay, clear? Okay, so at this point, God brought a famine because in the face of a hunger, there are only 2 possible responses. One is each man to himself. Could you picture this? Okay. The other is, look, we're all in this boat together. We have to make committees. We have to see to distribution because there's not enough for us all. Okay, clear? So obviously, the second one is what God wanted, but it's not what happened. Okay. So the reason I'm telling you this is that the famines are there to catalyze something. So this one, the one that's in the Torah now, is after the birth of Yaakov and Eisav, and they're going to different directions. There's a famine. So Yitzchak has no choice but to move. Okay, there's no food where he's living. So he does move, and then you have a replay of what happened to Avram and Sarah. Rivka is very beautiful, and the people of the place have her kidnapped and brought to the king. Okay? But this time, the outcome is somewhat different. Do you remember what happened with Sarah? He didn't touch her because an angel came and smote him with a plague so that he couldn't. This time, something different happened. God himself came to Avimelech in a dream and said, don't touch this woman. And he said, I did nothing wrong. Why are you threatening me? God threatened to destroy him and everything that he has. I was innocent. I thought she wasn't a married woman. I didn't just grab her off the street. I figured it's his sister. So why was he wrong anyway? Even if he sincerely thought that she wasn't a married woman, why was he wrong just to more or less force her into his life? No? Someone forces you into their life. You're not married. He's not destroying a family. Is it the right thing or the wrong thing? Why? Put it into words.
Because you can't force, it's like enslavement. You can't force
It's enslavement. Okay, so what answer did Avimelech give? And this is going to relate back to what we learned about Yaakov, Eisav in the heart. He went to Avraham. He said, why did you tell me, to Yitzchak, why did you say she's your sister? I acted in good faith. And here's what he answered. He didn't say, because this is enslavement, because what he did was legal by their laws. Here's what he said. There's no fear of God in this place. You would have killed me to get her. So what he's saying is that law without fear of God doesn't work. So I want you to think about legal systems, okay? In a law that I think is is observed by virtually every legal system is don't murder. Is that true?
Yeah. Unless you're like Islam.
Unless what?
Like you're Islam.
You're in Islam. But even they would say don't murder. Their definition of murder would exclude non-believers, but they would still, Okay, so when you say don't murder, is it, in America, do they believe that sincerely?
Yeah.
Yes. Could you see where in the legal system the way a murderer will be treated? And I'm going to give you a definition of murder. Murder is when you kill someone who's of no threat to you. Okay, clear? Okay, is it accurate to... What? Who's of no threat to you and you kill them. That's murder. Okay, even if you have two people who both killed someone who is of no threat to them at all, could it end up that they're treated differently? Okay, give me an example.
Depending on their race or problem.
Okay, let's look at a very current problem. Not too long ago, policemen were killing blacks pretty randomly. Now blacks are killing policemen pretty randomly. Is that true? Okay. Is it murder on both sides? Yes. So if you were to ask the policeman, do you believe that murder is bad, a week before he killed some innocent black man, would he say yes or no? He'd say yes. If you would ask this black person, is murder good or bad, what would he say? Bad. So how come they allow themselves to murder? We would agree that both of them are murders? Okay. So the reason is, if you have no fear of God, the one who you're accountable to is yourself. And that leaves room for a great deal of subjectivity. That makes sense to you? The same thing has to do with who the victim of the murder is. If the victim is somebody who people identify with, then the murderer is going to get a stiff sentence. But what if the victim is somebody who nobody identifies with? Will it be the same? What if the victim of a murder, let's say, right now in some old age home, there's a 98-year-old man who basically is out of it, on life support, and the nurse says, what do we need this for? And she pulls the plug, okay? Will she get the same treatment as though she killed somebody who was viable, productive, and enjoying life? Definitely not. Okay, is it still murder? Was this person somebody who's a threat to her? Absolutely not. So it depends on who the victim is, it depends on how much empathy you have, it depends on your level of subjectivity. It also depends on who the murderer is. If the murderer, even if the victim is somebody who you wouldn't want killed, if the murderer is somebody who grabs the public's heart, do you remember the OJ incident? He's also going to get an easier sentence. Isn't that true?
Yeah.
So the answer is there's no fear of God. What does fear of God mean, and what does it have to do with murder? So fear of God equals accountability, and it equals also into saying, I don't know everything, and it's not only my voice that has to be heard. So God caused this incident to happen while Eisav might have still been salvageable. If Eisav would have learned from what happened to the king of Pelishtim, he would have been a different person. He would have said, wait a minute, I've turned into a professional liar to get what I want to get in life. I'm going to have to account for this. Everyone accounts. But he didn't learn anything. Okay, clear? So life continues. Okay, so at this point, Yitzchak is now living in the land of Pelishtim. He's not going back to where he was living before because of the famine. He digs wells. Okay, well number one, the Philistines say, wait a minute, that well was pre-existent, it was just covered. Okay, it's ours. Okay, they call this well Oshek, which means quarrelsomeness. Second well. Okay, so the second well was one that Avram had dug in his time and now was covered. Yitzchak knew where it was, uncovered it. And again, the Pelishtim claimed it. And they called this well Sitna, which means hatred. The third well, okay, was the only one that they didn't fight about. And they gave that well a name also. They called it Rehovot, like the city. Okay, Rehovot means wide. They said, because now we have some space here. So this whole episode of the wells is discussed by the famous commentary, the Ramban. So it just occurred to me now, since you're Gesher, would you like to know something about the lives of the commentators? Okay, so Ramban lived in what should have been the golden age of Spain before the Inquisition, 200 years before. And Jews had enormous status and had held public office, sort of like America now. But as sort of a fluke, he ended up in this situation. The ruler of the time was called James of, which James was he? Not Castile, of Aragon. James of Aragon. Now, to understand what happened next, realize it must have gotten very boring in the palace at night. No media, no phones, no movies, no printing. Like, it was before the printing press. You couldn't even read like a bad novel and put yourself to sleep. So they had all of these amusements, okay? So James had the idea it would be very amusing, it would be an interesting night to have a debate between a Christian scholar and a Jewish scholar. That would be fun, right? So he more or less forced Ramban, whose name is an acronym for Rabbi Moshe ben Nachman, to represent the Jews. And the Christian was a man called Pablo Cristiani, who was actually a Jew who had converted to Catholicism. Okay, clear? So for his amusement, they're going to have a several-day debate.
I think I watched the movie.
You did?
Yeah.
Really? That's interesting. They made this, how did they make the movie last more than 15 minutes? Was it boring?
A little bit.
Yeah, I could see. It's like, you basically know the whole plot. Like so. So the debate took place over days. The records of the debate still exist. There's a book called Milchemet Hashem, Wars for God, where you hear all of the arguments against Christianity and against. The book is interesting, but Ramban won. Wow! In Spain in the Dark Ages, what do you think a Jew gets for winning a Catholic scholar in a debate? You're the lucky winner. What's going to happen now? You get to not die. Yay! Because normally somebody who would speak this way about the church would be dead. But because you're the lucky winner, you get to not die. Isn't that special? So Ramban realized that staying in Spain was not a really good option for him at this point. So he came to Israel. He found Israel so desolate that he didn't even have a minyan in Yerushalayim. To get a minyan, he had to travel to Hebron and bring people to Yerushalayim. Okay, he established the first synagogue after the exile era. This is why, this is a very important thing for you to know when you go to the old city. Have you seen the Ramban Synagogue? No, because you never heard of Ramban, and you wouldn't know what. Okay, whatever. You know the Chorva Synagogue, the very large synagogue in the Jewish quarter. It's very beautiful. So below it, you go not into the main entrance, but a little bit down towards the Kotel, you'll see a lower entrance. That's the Ramban Synagogue. The big synagogue was built over the more ancient synagogue. Now, obviously, what you see isn't how it looked in Ramban's time. Like people put in the linoleum, the electricity, whatever. Okay, the plastic chairs. But this is the oldest synagogue that we have in the post-exile era. So that was Ramban. So Ramban was a huge scholar. He was both a physician and a huge scholar. So he said everything that's in the Torah concerning the patriarchs and matriarchs are indeed something for their descendants to see as a map of their existence, and he includes the wells story in that. So here's what he says about the story of the wells. So he says that each of these wells, quoting the Talmud, parallel one of the temples that were like a spiritual well from which we drew nurture in later eras. Okay, clear? So let's look at the first temple. The first temple was built with great glory. It was built by King Solomon. It was unbelievably grandiose, full of gold, silver, every precious metal, gems on the floors. Okay. How did it end up destroyed? So there was the direct reason and the spiritual cause. Which interests you more, the direct reason or the spiritual cause? Choose. So the spiritual cause is that Israel is given to us on condition that we retain the example of the patriarchs and matriarchs in our hearts. There are 3 sins that are antithetical to how they lived. Those sins are adultery, idol worship, and murder. How so? What was Abraham's most central trait? Chesed. A person who's kind, no way could be promiscuous or be an adulterer. Why not? Okay, because the only one who a promiscuous person loves is themselves. A promiscuous person objectifies others. So the fact that the people sank down to a level where there was some adultery means they lost the Avraham within themselves. Okay, what was Yitzchak's main trait? Gvura, meaning being strong enough to be totally devoted to Hashem. Could a person like that worship idols? No. So there was rampant idol worship towards the end of the First Temple period. That meant that they totally lost the Yitzchak within them. Why do people worship idols? I want you to go back to what we said about Eisav, to the story with the Chazon Ish, to think, why do people worship idols? Okay, so people like things that are tangible, that's for sure, but I'm asking, how do they believe in it? If I know I made this idol, how could I believe in it?
They originally thought that they were just going through them to talk to Hashem, but they forgot.
So they thought that they were symbols of natural forces that Hashem created, and by dedicating themselves to these natural forces, they could draw down various sorts of energy. This is what they thought. Okay, so that's very convenient because it lets you take a shortcut. Remember, there's what I believe and know and what I feel. So you could take what I believe and He'll take care of it. If I worship this idol, I don't have to look inward. My devotion to this idol is my morality. So I want to tell you how this works in the modern world. So what I'm telling you is completely true, and the film of this, if I'm not mistaken, is in Yad Vashem. Okay, so the Commandant of Auschwitz was captured by the Israeli forces. Did you know this? His name was Eichmann. He had hidden himself after the war in Argentina. But the Israeli Secret Service, under a man whose name was Harel, so there were a lot of streets called Harel, he was the chief of Israeli intelligence. He captured him, brought him to Yerushalayim where there was a big show trial. So could you picture the trial? It was held in the big convention center, Binyanei Umah. They'd have witnesses talk about what they had seen him do in the concentration camps. He gave his testimony behind a glass enclosed booth because he would have been killed. Okay, clear? So finally, he was sentenced to death. This is the only time Israel ever gave anyone a death sentence. Okay? So, because this is Israel, it's a Western country, they asked him if he wanted to see a clergyman before he dies. So he did. He wanted to see a Protestant clergyman. So they brought this pastor to him. Now, this would not happen in contemporary Israel. It's so not politically correct, but this is Israel in 1965. As the pastor was leaving Eichmann, a newsman thrust a microphone in his face, and he said, "Is he going to go to heaven or hell? You just gave him last rites. What's going to happen to Eichmann?" What do you think the priest answered? Think of what you know of Christianity. No. He said he confessed his sins, made an act of contrition, put himself at the mercy of Christ. He's going to go to heaven. Now that was, and here's the part that I said would never happen today. Remember, the reporter's still there and it's 1965, so the Holocaust is still in people's hearts. He said, what about the 1 million children who were killed in the Holocaust, who didn't believe in Jesus? Where are they? You know what he said? Hell. This is what they believe, and it's on film. So the reason I'm telling you this is that idol worship is a very convenient way to allow your subconscious desire to not let what you know and believe touch your heart. It's very convenient. So people who worship idols can't be like Yitzchak. They don't let Yitzchak's voice, the voice of devotion, touch them. Okay, what was Yaakov's main trait? What does that mean? Okay, harmony and truth. Truth is a dimension of harmony. Give me a reasonable definition of truth. Notice how it's much easier to define what a lie is than to define what truth is.
Being honest?
That means not telling a lie, but what is truth? So I want to point out to you that most people instinctively see truth as verbal accuracy. So if I say this is a book, I'm telling the truth. If I were to say it's an elephant, I'm not telling the truth. But verbal accuracy is tricky. Something could be verbally accurate and not be true. Did any of you ever read the essay called The Vegetarian? Okay. There was a man who was a vegetarian. He grew up in hard circumstances. His parents were desperately poor. But he still maintained his ideals. He didn't just live hand to mouth. He was a vegetarian. He had to become self-supporting very early in his life. So even though he was brilliant and charismatic, he became a house painter. But he didn't just paint the houses, earn the money, and support himself. He had an ideal. He was a vegetarian. He was an idealistic person. He eventually went into politics. He captured the hearts of his entire country. Who are we talking about, do you know? Hitler. Everything I just said is true. Is it? It's accurate, but it's not true. It gives you a false picture of who Hitler was, even though technically everything I said is true. I'll give you another example. Suppose I were to tell you that Rabbi Liff wasn't arrested for wife beating. What image would you have?
I don't know, he's like a teddy bear.
I know, but if I told you that in a serious way, yeah? Did you hear what happened? The police didn't come after all. They're not arresting. Okay, yeah? You would think he's a wife beater, but just got away with it, even though that's not what I said. So verbal accuracy only takes you so far. Verbal accuracy and truth are not the same thing. Truth is bigger than verbal accuracy. Truth is seeing the whole picture. Okay, so that's why the Hitler story isn't really true, nor is the example I gave you with Rabbi Liff really true. Do humans usually see the whole picture? No. You have to be a very holy person to see the whole picture. You have to be able to get beyond subjectivity. So Tiferet, which is harmony, means being able to see the good and the bad and not go into denial about anything. Yeah? Yaakov's attribute was truth. When people murder, they've lost the truth, because that means they can't see the value of somebody else's life. It's not the whole picture. They don't get it. So in the examples I gave you of murder, the person who kills the person who's non-functional, they don't see the truth. This person's life has value. It's a human being. They lost it. So those three things meant that they lost their right to the land spiritually. The direct physical cause was the Babylonian conquest. The Babylonians hated the Jews. So the first well, which was the first temple, was destroyed through quarrelsomeness. Okay, clues? Our fragmentation that was mirrored by their hatred. Okay, so the Jews end up in Babylonia. They were exiled. Then the Persians conquered Babylonia, so the Jews are still in Babylonia, but guess what? Now it's called Persia, okay? So surprise, surprise. Okay, wake up, listen to the news, and Trump is president. Okay, yeah, surprise, you're now in Persia. Okay. The Persians, you know the Purim story, right? So Esther had a child with Achashverosh. That child's name was Daryavish in Hebrew, in English, Darius. Any of you heard? Somebody in this class said they liked history. No? Is there somebody here?
Yeah.
She's not here today. Anyway, Darius the Mede. That would actually ring bells to some people. Okay, he allowed the Jews to return to Israel. They went to Israel. So there's more to it than that. He died, he was succeeded, there was a lot of stuff in between. But they went back, built the second temple. The second temple was not as grand as the first, just like the second well wasn't like the first well, but it was destroyed for an entirely different reason. Do any of you know why the second temple, the spiritual reason for its destruction was? Senseless hatred. Okay. Senseless hatred means that you no longer see yourself as one with the rest of the Jewish community, only with people who you like in the Jewish community. And that means, again, your right to the land is compromised. So here, I find this very interesting. The direct physical cause was actually needless hatred. So you know the Hanukkah story? Yeah? Okay, so the winners of the game in the Hanukkah story were the Maccabees, right? So the next king of Israel was a Maccabee. Fast forward, okay, only a few generations later, guess what? One of their descendants became a Hellenist, a pro-Greek. Oh well, okay. He died. His widow ruled. So she was very famous. Her name was Shlom Tzion. Okay, there's a big street named for her in Yerushalayim. It's a popular Israeli name. People call people whose name is Shlom Tzion. Shlom Tzi, okay, whatever. Okay, so things were going well. She had 2 sons. This is where things get hairy. Okay, Hyrcanus and Aristobulus. So from their names you could see that they were already highly assimilated. The elder would have logically been the one to succeed his mother. That makes sense? But the second one was more aggressive and more charismatic. So you have senseless hatred. So who do you think won this one? The stronger and more charismatic one or the weaker one? So you would think the stronger one, and he's the one who began the battle and who began the process of victory. However, the weaker one saw where things were going, and he made allegiances with Rome and brought in the Romans to help him maintain his claim on the throne. And once they came, they never left. Okay, so it was literally senseless hatred that brought about the destruction, even in terms of its physical side. So that was the second well, which is called Sitna, which means hatred. But then the third well is the one about which we have prophecies for the future. The day will come, will overcome the senseless hatred enough to believe that Eretz Yisrael is wide enough to accommodate any person, any Jew, where you don't have to be me and I don't have to be you. I could learn from you, you could learn from me. That's called Rehovot, and this is, of course, the third temple that will be built by Mashiach. So what does this have to do, this well story, with the whole rest of the Parsha? So what this has to do with the rest of the Parsha is that this vision of quarrelsomeness is now going to characterize the relationship of Yaakov and Eisav forever. And it's not going to be resolved until Mashiach comes. Why? Because they're both fighting for the same thing, and Eisav is incapable of resolution because the gap between his mind and his heart and his beliefs is irresolvable. So we're going to see how this is finalized. We have a class tomorrow, right? So we're going to have to see how this is finalized in the end of Yaakov's life, when he gives the blessings to Yaakov rather than to Eisav, even though Eisav was the firstborn. Okay? That's it for now.